1888, London, the East End. If you close your eyes and try to picture it, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the fog. That thick, yellow, clinging pea super fog that you can practically taste. You can almost smell the sulfur and the coal smoke, the unwashed bodies and the damp rot coming off the river.
It's a setting that's been burned into our collective imagination, hasn't it? From, I don't know, Sherlock Holmes to countless films.
Exactly. It's the ultimate backdrop for a ghost story.
Yeah.
But today, looking at this massive stack of files and research you've pulled together, we are not here to tell a ghost story.
No, absolutely not. We're not here to indulge in the supernatural or the theatrical. We're going back to a very stark, very brutal historical reality.
A reality of poverty and overcrowding and a shadow that moved through those gaslit streets, leaving a scar on the city that has, well, it's never quite healed.
It really hasn't.
We are talking, of course, about Jack the Ripper, and this is where we're going to pivot from the usual narrative. We're looking at the facts, the actual facts contained in the Whitechapel murders police files.
Right.
We want to try and distinguish between the man, the myth, and just the absolute media frenzy that blurred the lines between the two.
And that's such a crucial distinction because it gets lost so often. The name Jack the Ripper is so famous, so theatrical, that it completely eclipses the actual police investigation.
Yeah.
In the files, you see other names being used by the press and the public at the time. Names like the Whitechapel murderer or Leather Apron.
Leather Apron, right. That one was tied to a specific kind of xenophobia, which we'll get into.
We will. And these weren't just catchy nicknames. They reflected how the community and the police were desperately trying to grapple with a threat they just couldn't identify.
So to guide us through this labyrinth, we have a stack of sources that is, honestly, it's a bit intimidating. We're looking at historical records, what remains of the original police files, which is a whole story in its own.
Oh, it is.
Contemporaneous journalism from 1888, and of course, modern analysis of that Victorian investigation.
And our mission today is really to peel back those layers of what's called ripperology. We want to understand the context of these crimes. You really can't understand the murders without understanding Whitechapel in 1888.
You have to set the stage.
You have to set the stage.
Yeah.
We want to bring the victims out from the shadow of the killer because they are so often just a list of names overshadowed by the mystery of his identity. And perhaps most interestingly, we need to look at why this specific case became the blueprint for the modern media circus surrounding serial killers.
It really is the first of its kind in that sense.
It is the birth of a phenomenon.
So let's unpack this. We have to start with the stage, as you said. If you were walking through Whitechapel in 1888, what are you seeing? What are you smelling? Because the sources, they paint a picture of a place that was essentially a powder keg waiting for a match.
Powder keg is the perfect term. The East End, and specifically the parish of Whitechapel, was a place of extreme density and extreme poverty. By 1888, the population of Whitechapel had risen to approximately 80,000 inhabitants.
80,000 in that small an area.
In that small an area. And just to give you a sense of the overcrowding, the housing stock hadn't increased to match that influx of people. You had families living in single rooms. You had people living in conditions that are, frankly, hard for us to even imagine today.
I was reading about the death rates, and it's just staggering. 55% of children born in the East End died before the age of 5.
55%.
That is a statistic that just stops you in your tracks. It tells you everything you need to know about the sanitation, the nutrition, the general struggle for survival.
It absolutely does. And that struggle for survival, it dictated everything. Robbery, violence, alcohol dependency. They were all commonplace. But it wasn't just about, inherent criminality. It was about coping with absolute misery.
A means to an end.
A means to an end. And this economic pressure is directly, and I mean directly, linked to the victims. The endemic poverty drove many women to prostitution simply to survive. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a necessity to earn the few pence for their next meal or for a bed for the night.
Speaking of beds, the housing situation is where it gets really fascinating and really grim. The sources mention these common lodging houses.
The Doss houses, yeah.
And there were 233 of them in Whitechapel alone.
233, housing about 8,500 people every single night. But you have to get the image of a hotel or a hostel out of your mind. These were not that.
So what were they?
They were vast, often filthy, communal spaces where you paid for a spot to sleep. And the pricing structure tells you just how desperate things were.
Right, I saw this. A coffin bed, which was literally a wooden box you could lie down in to stop you rolling out and to stop others from robbing you while you slept. That cost 4 pence a night.
4 pence, which in modern money is roughly, what, about 2 pounds?
Something like that. It's not nothing when you have nothing.
Exactly. And if you couldn't afford 4 pence,
Then you had the lean-to, which I just find incredible.
it's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? For 2 pence, you could sleep on a rope that was stretched across the dormitory. You literally lean over a rope to sleep, packed in with dozens of other people.
It's where the phrase hungover potentially comes from. I don't know if that's true, but it paints a picture.
It paints a very vivid picture of the transient nature of this population. These women, the victims, they didn't have a front door they could lock. They didn't have a safe space. They were out in the open, moving between lodging houses, constantly vulnerable.
And it wasn't a stable community either. There was a lot of tension in the air about who was living there, wasn't there? It wasn't just a community of impoverished Londoners who had been there for generations.
Not at all. It was a melting pot under immense pressure. In the mid-19th century, you had a huge influx of Irish immigrants fleeing the famine. Then, from 1882 onwards, you had a wave of Jewish refugees fleeing the pogroms in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe.
And they're all coming to the same place.
All coming to the same square mile. All competing for the same scarce resources, the same terrible housing, the same low-paying jobs in sweatshops or on the docks.
So you have overcrowding, poverty, and now ethnic and religious tension.
You've got it. And this, of course, led to a rise in social unrest. Between 1886 and 1889, there were frequent demonstrations by the unemployed and the socialist movements. You might have heard of Bloody Sunday in 1887.
Trafalgar Square, yeah.
Where police and the army intervened in a massive protest. The authorities were already on edge. The public perception of Whitechapel, even before the murders, was that it was a notorious den of immorality, a place respectable people didn't go.
Which brings us to the perfect storm. You have this transient population, nobody knows their neighbor, a police force that is, frankly, viewed with suspicion and hostility by the locals.
Deep suspicion. They were seen as an occupying force in many ways.
And you have this physical labyrinth of dark, unlit alleys, courtyards, and overcrowded slums. It seems like the killer couldn't have asked for a better environment to just disappear into.
That is the absolute key point. The killer didn't just vanish into thin air. He vanished into a crowd. He vanished into a chaotic, anonymous environment where people were coming and going at all hours of the day and night. He could look just like anybody else.
Okay, so that's the stage. Let's move to the crimes themselves. When we talk about Jack the Ripper, most people, they think of 5 victims, the canonical 5. But the police file, the actual Whitechapel murders docket, it's bigger than that. It includes 11 murders between April 1888 and February 1891.
That's right. The police were investigating a broad and terrifying spike in violence against women in the area. But historians and ripperologists, they generally agree on the canonical 5. These are the 5 victims who are widely believed to be the work of the same hand due to the specific, horrific nature of their injuries.
And those 5 are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly.
The canonical 5.
But before we get to the first of those, Mary Ann Nichols, there were others in that police file, like Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram. Why aren't they usually counted as Ripper victims?
Well, Emma Elizabeth Smith was attacked in April of 1888. And she actually survived long enough to tell the medical staff at the hospital that she was attacked by a gang of 2 or 3 men.
Ah, so a gang. That doesn't fit the profile.
Exactly. It doesn't fit the profile of the solitary, stealthy killer that we see later. Martha Tabram, though, she's a much more debated case.
She was killed in August 1888, right?
Yeah.
Very close to the first canonical murder.
Very close. Just a few weeks before. She was found in a lodging house staircase, and she had suffered 39 stab wounds.
39? That sounds incredibly brutal. A frenzy.
It was a complete frenzy. But the distinction that most investigators point to is the weapon and the method. Tabram was stabbed repeatedly, possibly with a bayonet or a penknife, something small and sharp. The canonical Ripper murders, they were characterized by these deep, clean slash wounds to the throat.
To silence them first.
Just silence them first, followed by the specific abdominal mutilation. Tabram didn't have her throat cut in that signature manner. So while some experts think she might have been an early victim where the killer was maybe learning or escalating his method,
The MO wasn't there yet.
the modus operandi is different enough that she's usually excluded from the main 5. It's a key point of debate, though.
Okay, so let's look at the first of the canonical 5, the one that really starts the terror. Mary Ann Nichols, August 31st, 1888.
Mary Ann Polly Nichols. She's found in a dark gateway in Bucks Row at about 3:40 in the morning by a cart driver on his way to work.
And this is where we see the signature established.
This is it. Her throat was severed by 2 deep cuts, one of which went all the way back to the vertebrae. And then there is the abdominal mutilation, a deep, jagged wound. It's brutal, but it's also clear. The pattern is established. Throat cut first to silence and kill, then the mutilation starts.
And the police at this point, they're horrified. But they don't know this is the start of a series.
No, not yet. It's a shocking murder, even for Whitechapel. But it's just one murder. That changes just over a week later.
September 8th. Victim number 2, Annie Chapman. And here is where it gets it gets much worse.
Oh.
Because you see clear escalation.
A terrifying escalation. Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Again, throat severed, almost decapitated. But this time, the abdominal mutilation was completely horrifying. The abdomen was cut entirely open.
And this is the crucial detail. Something was missing.
Yes. The uterus and sections of the bladder and vagina were removed by the killer and were missing from the scene.
And this detail is what lights a fire under the investigation, right? Because it starts the speculation that the killer had to have some kind of anatomical knowledge.
That was the immediate theory. You don't just randomly remove a specific organ in the dark, in a backyard, in a matter of minutes without knowing what you're doing and where it is.
It's not a random slashing, it's a removal.
It's a removal. And we also have a witness in this case, which is incredibly rare. A woman named Elizabeth Long. She testified that she saw Chapman at about 5:30 in the morning, just half an hour before the body was found.
So very close to the time of death.
Very close. And she was with a man. She described him as having dark hair, wearing a deerstalker hat, which is such an iconic but maybe misleading detail.
Right, the Sherlock Holmes hat.
Exactly. And a dark overcoat. She called his appearance shabby genteel.
Shabby genteel. I love that phrase. It's so Victorian. It's like he was trying to look respectable, but wasn't quite pulling it off.
That's the perfect description. And she overheard a tiny snippet of conversation. The man asked, "Will you?" And Chapman replied, "Yes."
So a transaction, a solicitation.
It almost certainly implies a transaction. It confirms the predatory nature of the killer targeting these women who are working the streets to survive.
Okay, so now there are 2 victims. Same method, but escalating violence. Panic is starting to set in. But then we come to the night that really sent the city into absolute hysterics, the double event. September 30th, 2 murders in one night.
This is the night that cemented the legend of Jack the Ripper as a kind of supernatural monster. It started with Elizabeth Stride. Her body was found at 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard by a man named Louis Diemschutz, who was entering the yard with his pony and cart.
And the pony shied, right. That's how you found her.
The pony shied at the body in the dark. He found her, throat cut, severing the carotid artery. She was still bleeding, so she had been killed just moments before.
But, and it's the key detail for Stride, there was something different. Or rather, something missing.
Yes. There was no further mutilation, just the throat wound. And the universally accepted theory is that the killer was interrupted. Diemschutz entering the yard with his cart scared him off. He had to flee before he could finish what he intended to do.
So he's frustrated, he's enraged, he hasn't satisfied whatever terrible urge drives him.
That is the psychological reading, yes. And it seems to be borne out by what happens next. Because just 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes is found in Mitre Square.
And this is significant for the police, because Mitre Square is in the City of London's jurisdiction.
A different police force. The Whitechapel murders had been the responsibility of the Metropolitan Police. Now he's crossed a border, which created massive confusion and rivalry in the investigation.
And with Eddowes, the violence was, it was much worse, wasn't it? It was like he was making up for lost time.
It was extreme. The mutilation was far more severe than on any of the previous victims. The abdomen was opened up, the intestines thrown over her shoulder, the uterus and the left kidney were removed and taken.
The left kidney, that becomes important later.
Very important. But he also targeted her face. Her nose was severed, her eyelids were cut, and there were these strange triangular incisions carved into her cheeks. It was an attack on her very identity as well as her body, a total depersonalization.
I was reading the report from the police surgeon on this, Dr. Frederick Brown. He estimated that the mutilations on Eddowes would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete. That might not sound like a long time, but you have to imagine it. In a public square, in the dark, with police patrols walking their beats nearby. That is just unbelievably brazen.
It speaks to a terrifying level of control and situational awareness. He wasn't just a frenzied madman. He knew the beat of the police constables. He knew exactly how much time he had. He was in control.
And then, after the double event, there's a pause. October passes. The city is on a knife's edge. And then in November, we have the final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, November 9th. And this one is different.
This one is the climax of the horror because it happened indoors.
Right. 13 Miller's Court. Mary Jane Kelly had her own small room. She wasn't on the street.
And because she was inside, behind a locked door, or at least a closed door, the killer had time. He wasn't worried about a passing patrolman or a pony and cart. He had privacy. He had all the time in the world to fully enact his most horrific fantasies.
The scene, I mean, the police reports and the photographs that exist are just, they're beyond words.
They are. The mutilation was so extensive that her landlord, who found her, could barely identify her as human, let alone as Mary Kelly. Her face was hacked beyond recognition. Organs were removed and deliberately placed around the room, some on the bedside table, some under her head. Her heart was missing entirely, taken from the scene.
There's a detail in the file about the fireplace that just gave me chills.
Yes. The police found a large amount of ash in the grate. The fire had been so intense that it had melted the solder on a kettle that was sitting there.
So what was he burning?
The implication is that he was burning her clothes, maybe some other items, to create light. He needed to see what he was doing. This wasn't just a frenzied attack in the dark. This was a prolonged, illuminated, systematic desecration of a human body.
It's absolutely horrific. And it really does highlight the escalation from Nichols' comparatively simple murder to this indoor abattoir. It's like watching a fire burn hotter and hotter until it consumes everything.
And that's why Mary Jane Kelly is almost universally considered the final victim of Jack the Ripper. The violence reached such an unbelievable peak that many profilers and historians argue he likely burned out. That he died, or was institutionalized, or maybe even committed suicide shortly after. It's hard to imagine an escalation beyond what happened in Miller's Court.
So we have these 5 brutal crimes. We have a terrified city. What were the police actually doing? We have to remember this is 1888. They didn't have CSI. They didn't have DNA or fingerprinting.
No, their toolkit was incredibly limited. No fingerprinting yet. That was still a few years away. No blood type analysis. The investigation relied almost entirely on boots on the ground.
Just good old-fashioned police work.
Old-fashioned police work. They conducted massive house-to-house inquiries. We're talking about interviewing over 2,000 people. They distributed hundreds of thousands of leaflets with descriptions of suspects, which were often contradictory.
And they were questioning, what, sailors? Butchers?
Everyone. They were looking for witnesses, for anyone who saw something suspicious, anyone with blood on their clothes. But in a place like Whitechapel, where life was so violent, a man with some blood on his shirt might not even have stood out.
You mentioned the jurisdiction issue earlier, the City of London Police versus the Metropolitan Police. How much did that hamper the investigation?
It certainly complicated things. There were 2 separate forces with separate leadership structures, separate commissioners. They didn't always share information effectively. There was a professional rivalry there.
And tragically for us, for historians, the City of London police file
were largely destroyed during the Blitz in World War II. So a huge chunk of the primary data from the investigation into the Eddowes murder specifically is just gone forever.
There was one piece of physical evidence, or at least potential evidence, that caused a massive conflict between the 2 forces, the Golston Street graffito. This is a really fascinating and controversial moment in the investigation.
It really is. So, after the double event, in the early hours of the morning, a police constable found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' bloodied apron in the entryway of a tenement building on Golston Street.
So this was a clue. It showed the direction the killer fled from Mitre Square.
A crucial clue. And above where the apron piece was dropped, written in chalk on the brick wall, was a sentence. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
Jews. J-U-W-E-S. That's a very peculiar spelling.
Very peculiar. And immediately the question is, did the killer write it?
Right. Is this a message?
Is it a message from the Ripper, perhaps trying to taunt the police, or more sinisterly trying to incite violence against the Jewish community? Or was it just incidental anti-Semitic graffiti, which sadly was all too common in the East End at the time? We'll never know for sure, but the reaction to it is what's so important.
Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, he arrived on the scene, and he made a very controversial decision, didn't he?
A hugely controversial decision. He ordered it to be washed off the wall immediately, before dawn. He didn't wait for a photographer, which was the standard procedure for evidence.
Why? Why would he do that?
His reasoning, which he defended later, was public safety. He was convinced that if the public of Whitechapel woke up and saw that message linking a horrific murder directly to the Jewish community, It would spark massive anti-Semitic riots.
So he prioritized public order over preserving potential evidence.
He did. And he was probably right about the risk of riots. Given the tensions we discussed earlier, the atmosphere was that volatile. But from an investigative standpoint, he destroyed what might have been the only sample of the killer's handwriting, not to mention a potential psychological clue. It remains one of the big what-ifs of the entire case.
The police were also trying to build a profile of the killer. And we tend to think of criminal profiling as a modern invention, something from Mindhunter. But they were doing a version of it back then.
They were. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, was asked to review the case files and the mortuary reports for the victims, and he produced what is essentially the first offender profile.
And his assessment is really interesting because it completely contradicts a lot of what we see in the movies.
It absolutely does. In popular culture, Jack the Ripper is so often portrayed as this mad doctor or a brilliant surgeon, someone with precise anatomical skill.
Gentleman killer.
Exactly. But Dr. Bond, who had actually examined the bodies, he argued the exact opposite. He stated, and I'm paraphrasing, that the killer did not have scientific or anatomical knowledge. He said the cuts didn't show the technical skill of a surgeon or even a butcher. They were just brutal slashes.
So if not a doctor, who did he think the killer was?
Bond profiled him as a man of solitary habits. Quiet, unassuming, maybe lived alone. He suggested the killer suffered from periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania.
So a cyclical killer, bouts of insanity.
Yes. He believed the man likely had no steady employment and probably appeared quite harmless or eccentric to his neighbors when he wasn't in one of these manic states.
That phrase, erotic mania, Bond, was picking up on the sexual element of the crimes, wasn't he? Even though there was no evidence of sexual assault in the traditional sense.
Correct. And that's incredibly forward-thinking for 1888. Bond noted that there was no evidence of sexual activity with the victims, but the degrading positions of the bodies and the very nature of the wounds, especially the removal of the uterus, suggested to him that the killer derived a form of sexual pleasure from the act of killing and mutilation itself. It's a very modern psychological concept.
Okay, this brings us to the name, Jack the Ripper. It's such a sticky name. It sounds like a character from a penny, dreadful. Exactly. And that might be because, well, it probably was. Let's talk about the letters.
This is where the media phenomenon really takes over the criminal investigation. The police and the press, particularly the Central News Agency, were just being inundated with letters, hundreds of them.
All claiming to be the killer.
All claiming to be the killer. And most were obvious hoaxes. You could tell from the handwriting, the language, they were just people causing trouble. But there are three that stand out and have become central to the Ripper legend.
The first being the Dear Boss letter.
The Dear Boss letter. It was received in late September between the murders of Chapman and the double event. It was written in this very distinctive red ink.
And it was signed Jack the Ripper.
That's it. This was the first time that signature was ever used. The writer taunts the police, calls them leather apron fools, and promises he's down on whores and won't stop ripping them. And then he makes a specific threat.
He promised to clip the lady's ears off.
Yes. And ominously, just a few days after this letter was made public, Catherine Eddowes was found with a nicked ear.
Which must have seemed like proofs to the public and the police at the time.
It gave the letter immense credibility. The police even published facsimiles of it, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. But modern analysis, and even the opinion of some of the senior police officials at the time, suggest the Dear Boss letter was a complete fabrication.
A fabrication by who?
The leading theory is that it was written by a journalist, possibly a man named Tom Bullen or Fred Best, who worked for the Star newspaper. The idea was to create a compelling narrative, to give the monster a catchy name, and ultimately to spike newspaper circulation.
And it worked.
It worked spectacularly well. The name Jack the Ripper terrified the public and sold 1 million papers.
Then there's the Saucy Jackie postcard.
That arrived on October 1st, right after the double event. It was also sent to the Central News Agency. It referenced the 2 murders the night before, saying double event this time.
And it was posted before the details were widely known, which again lent it some weight.
It did, but again, the handwriting was very similar to the Dear Boss letter. Most experts believe it's from the same author, likely the same journalist, keeping his story going.
But then we have the third letter, the From Hell letter. And this one this one feels completely different.
This one is the stuff of nightmares. It has a totally different tone. It wasn't sent to the press or the police. It was sent directly to George Lusk, who was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee.
A group of local volunteers who were patrolling the streets themselves.
Exactly. And it didn't have the flashy Jack the Ripper signature. It was much rougher, full of spelling and grammatical errors. It read like it was written by someone uneducated and deeply disturbed.
And it came with a box.
A small cardboard box, and inside was half of a preserved human kidney.
And the letter claimed.
The letter began "from hell" and went on to say, "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice."
I fried and ate it. That is just, it's repulsive. It's a level of depravity beyond the other letters. Was the kidney real?
Dr. Openshaw, a pathologist, examined it. He confirmed it was a human kidney from the left side and that it showed signs of Bright's disease, a kidney ailment. Catherine Eddowes had her left kidney removed, and it was known she suffered from Bright's disease.
So is hers.
He couldn't prove it was her. Kidney medical science wasn't there yet, but he couldn't rule it out. And stylistically, the "from hell" letter is the one that most experts take seriously as potentially being genuine. It lacks the theatrical flair of "Dear Boss." It feels raw. It feels real.
So we have a named killer. Courtesy of the press, we have taunting letters, one of which might be real. The city is in an absolute panic. Who are the police looking at? Who are the actual suspects? Because looking at the files, the net was cast pretty wide.
It was. And sadly, the first major suspect really illustrates the xenophobia and anti-Semitism of the time. We talked about that early nickname, Leather Apron.
Right, from before the Ripper name took hold.
Yes. The press and local gossip latched onto a man named John Picer. He was a local Jewish man who made footwear, hence the leather apron. He was known to have a temper and was said to bully prostitutes.
He fit the public's profile of the other, the dangerous outsider.
He was the perfect scapegoat. He was arrested, the press ran wild with it, but he had solid alibis for the nights of the murders. He was with family or in a police station for a minor offense during another one. He was released. But it just shows how quickly the public wanted to blame the immigrant population.
What about the more logical suspects? Butchers, for instance. If the killer wasn't a surgeon, a butcher seems like the next best guess, given the knife skills.
The police absolutely thought so, too. They investigated 76 butchers and slaughterers in the area. They checked their alibis, their tools. They even investigated the cattle boats that docked in the Thames.
The theory being a sailor or cattle drover could come ashore, commit a murder, and then sail away. A perfect disappearing act.
Exactly. But when they checked the maritime records, the schedules for the cattle boats just didn't align with the murder dates. That line of inquiry went cold.
Then you have the other end of the social spectrum.
Yeah.
The mad doctor or the aristocrat. The idea that the Rippers was a wealthy gentleman in a top hat venturing into the slums to hunt.
This is a very powerful and enduring myth. It speaks to a very real class anxiety of the Victorian era. The poor in the East End felt, quite rightly, that they were being exploited by the rich in the West End.
So the idea of a predatory aristocrat, literally preying on them, resonated culturally.
It resonated deeply. It fits the narrative of exploitation. But in terms of actual evidence, there's very, very little to support. It's more of a social metaphor than a police theory.
But there were specific names, right? Sir Melville Macnaghten, a top police official, wrote a famous internal memo in 1894 where he named 3 specific suspects.
He did. Though it's important to note this was years after the murders, and he admitted the evidence was purely circumstantial. His top suspect was a man named Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who was found drowned in the Thames shortly after the last murder.
So the timeline fits. The murders stop when he dies.
The timeline fits perfectly. Macnaghten believed Druitt's own family suspected him, but there's no evidence at all linking him to Whitechapel or the crimes. The second suspect was Aaron Kosminski.
A Polish-Jewish hairdresser who lived in Whitechapel.
Yes. He suffered from severe mental illness and had a documented hatred of women. He was institutionalized in an asylum in 1891. He's a very compelling suspect, and he's the one who was recently named in a controversial DNA study.
We have to talk about that. The so-called Ripper shawl.
Right. A shawl, supposedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body, was analyzed a few years ago. The researchers claimed to find mitochondrial DNA matching descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski.
So, case closed.
Oh, not at all. The scientific community heavily criticized the study. First, the provenance of the shawl is extremely dubious. There's no proof it was ever at the crime scene. Second, mitochondrial DNA is not unique like nuclear DNA. It's passed down the maternal line. Thousands of people could have had the same profile. And third, the risk of contamination over 130 years is astronomical.
So we have to be very, very skeptical.
Extremely skeptical. The truth is, the physical evidence just doesn't exist to give us a definitive answer. McNaughton's third suspect, by the way, was a man named Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man, but he was in jail in France during the murders, so he's a non-starter.
So the identity remains a mystery, a frustrating, tantalizing mystery. But the legacy, that is undeniable. This case, this media frenzy, it essentially gave birth to the true crime genre as we know it today.
It absolutely did. And that's largely due to a perfect storm of social changes. The Elementary Education Act of 1880 had made school compulsory. So by 1888, you had a huge, newly literate working class.
A new market for news.
A massive new market. You combined that new literacy with tax reforms that made newspapers incredibly cheap, the halfpenny paper.
So you have a literate population hungry for stories, and you have cheap papers hungry for circulation.
And this story had everything. It had sex, it had extreme violence, it had mystery, it had class conflict, and thanks to a clever journalist, it had a terrifyingly catchy name.
Newspapers sold 1 million copies a day during the height of the investigation.
1 million copies. The press realized that fear sells. Sensation sells. Journalists were inventing stories, forging letters, as we discussed, anything to keep the story on the front page and keep the business alive. They turned a human tragedy into a serialized drama.
And that gave rise to ripperology.
A term that was actually coined much later, in the 1970s. It describes the intense study of the case, but it also hints at the obsession, the cottage industry that grew up around it.
And Jack the Ripper transitioned from being a real, terrifying threat to a bogeyman, a character.
He became a character. A bogeyman for children, and then a fictional trope. He's in movies, he's in comic books, he fights Sherlock Holmes, he travels through time. He became public domain.
There was that controversy a few years ago, in 2015, with the Jack the Ripper Museum in London.
Yes, that was a huge controversy. It was originally pitched to the local council as a museum of women's history in the East End. But when it opened its doors, it was a museum dedicated entirely to the killer, full of gory memorabilia.
And there were protests.
Huge protests, and you still see it today. Protests against fish and chip shops that open up with names like Jack the Chipper. It raises a really valid and uncomfortable question. How we turned a brutal serial killer of vulnerable women into a brand, a tourist attraction.
Have we forgotten the brutality of what happened to Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly?
That is the difficult balance, isn't it? We are fascinated by the mystery, but it's so easy to forget the human cost. The real victims were not just killed, their identities have been almost completely erased by the legend of their murderer.
That is a deeply uncomfortable thought. But looking at the sources, there was perhaps one, just one, positive outcome from all this horror.
If you can call it a silver lining, and it's a very dark cloud.
Yeah.
The murderers shone a spotlight on the East End that could not be ignored. The press, for all its sensationalism, couldn't help but report on the squalid conditions in which these women lived and died.
So the public was horrified not just by the murders, but by the world they took place in.
Exactly. For the first time, wealthy Londoners in the West End were forced to confront the reality of the poverty in their own city. And in the 2 decades following the murders, there was a significant real movement for slum clearance and housing reform. The worst of the rookeries and lodging houses were demolished.
So the tragedy did, in a way, force the city to look in the mirror.
It did. It forced an acknowledgement that you cannot let people live in such desperation without there being terrible consequences for the entire society.
So when we wrap this all up, what does it all mean? We've revisited the 11 murders in the file, the canonical 5, the failed investigation, and the media storm that created a legend.
For me, the biggest takeaway is that Jack the Ripper is really 2 separate things. There is the man, a brutal, probably local, mentally disturbed offender who killed at least 5 women in the autumn of 1888. He was a human being, a monster, but a human one.
And then there's the legend.
And then there's the legend, the genius villain, the phantom in the fog, the top-hatted aristocrat, the mastermind. And the legend, I think, was created by the media to sell papers and by society as a whole to explain why the police failed so spectacularly.
It's easier to believe the police were outsmarted by a Moriarty-style evil genius than to admit that they were just completely overwhelmed by the poverty, the anonymity, and the chaos of their own city. That the killer wasn't a genius, he was just a ghost in a broken system.
Precisely. The legend excuses the failure. And that legend, that character of Jack the Ripper, has cast a shadow over every serial killer case since. It created the template. It turned tragedy into entertainment.
That is a provocative thought to end on. The idea that Jack the Ripper might not be a single criminal mastermind to be unmasked, but a hybrid, a combination of a brutal, pathetic killer and a powerful media creation. A ghost story we wrote for ourselves to hide a more uncomfortable truth.
It certainly makes you rethink what you see on the news today, doesn't it? The same patterns are there.
We encourage you to look at the sources yourself. Question what you think you know about history's most famous cold case, because the truth is usually grittier, sadder, and much more human than the myth. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Bye.